Stories are unnecessary risks. My name is Osadmebi, and every week I will tell you a short story written by a Nigerian writer or author. That's the long and short of it. So without much ado, this week's story is by Esther Eiyegbeni, and it's titled A Risk Too Far. You can start. Rustling of papers, quiet gasps, and murmurs filled the hall as students began to familiarize themselves with the words on the exam papers before them. Miriam's eyes, however, were fixed on Mr. Victor, the Agric teacher, as he wrote on the blackboard. Biology. Start. 11:30 a.m. End. 1 p.m. She smiled. An hour and 30 minutes was more than enough to execute her plan. She shifted in her seat, pretending to stretch, while her eyes scanned the hall. The rows were spaced with 6 chairs each, enough to keep students from whispering to each other. It made cheating impossible. But not everyone was Miriam. Do not look to your left or to your right. Just focus on the paper that is in front of you and do your work by yourself, warned Mrs. Njideka, the big-boned CRS teacher, as she walked between rows looking from left to right, inspecting. Sitting on the 4th row of the 2nd column, Miriam felt safe. Everyone was too consumed with their work, and 3 of the invigilators, including Mrs. Abosede, the home economics teacher, they were busy in the corner talking. Miriam's smile widened. It felt too good to be true. The contraband was right where it belonged, just beneath the curve of her left bra cup. Bending slightly, she undid the first 2 buttons of her shirt, slowly slipped her fingers in, and retrieved the piece of paper. As her heartbeat began to gallop, she focused on her breathing and remained calm. She could not afford to ruin the moment. She unfolded the piece of paper, careful not to make a sound. A quick scan of the room to make sure the coast was still clear, and then she buttoned up her shirt. She looked again to the front of the room where Mrs. Njideka was now leaning against a desk, flipping lazily through a magazine. The other 2 invigilators were still in the corner talking, their invigilating style not unusual to the monotony of another WAEC exam. Flattening the piece of paper against her desk, Miriam's eyes gleamed with excitement. The answers were all there, just as the biology teacher had hinted during the so-called review session. Why waste time cramming when she could simply copy? She looked at the questions, and then at the answers on the cheat sheet. They aligned. It felt like destiny. I can do this, she thought. But as she wrote, the sweat on her palms betrayed her confidence. She couldn't help but think of what would happen if she was caught. An F grade. Or worse, her paper would be withdrawn. She paused for a moment to wipe her palms on her skirt, and a freak accident ensued. Subconsciously, she let out a long exhale, and the gust from her breath caught the edge of the cheat sheet, which was no longer anchored by her hands. She watched in horror as the piece of paper sailed over the front of the desk and floated to the floor. Shock stopped her from scrambling after the paper and drawing attention to herself. Recovering quickly, though, she lifted her foot and placed it over the piece of paper. She kept her head down and pretended to scribble a few words on her answer sheet before her eyes darted around the room. No change with the invigilators. No one seemed to notice. Thank God. Another minute of pretend writing before she slowly and carefully wiggled her foot, nudging the piece of paper further under her shoe. Some more pretend scribbling, a quick glance up and around, and then she saw him. He was standing in front of the hall, staring. He was wearing a plain white shirt and dark-tailored pinstriped trousers, which looked like he had spent hours ironing them. She could not figure out how she hadn't seen him earlier. His expression was stern, but it was his eyes that gripped her, as if looking straight through her. Her throat went dry. She quickly averted her gaze as she wondered who he was. She was sure he was not a teacher. Mr. Victor's sudden laugh answered her question. With a grin, he handed the man a small gift bag. The stranger accepted it without a smile, setting it on the desk beside him. He had to be the external invigilator. The clock above the chalkboard read 12 p.m. Half an hour had passed, and she had hardly begun. What was she going to do? As she contemplated her options, the man began to walk around the hall, his gaze sweeping over each desk. Miriam tightened her grip on her pen and kept chanting in her head, "Just keep writing. Act normal. Everything will be okay." She began actually writing on her answer sheet, but it was all nonsense. Since she had not bothered to read, she didn't know the answers, but she just kept writing. Then she heard slow footsteps coming up behind her. She began to sweat and pray. She just needed him to leave so she could retrieve the paper. The footsteps came to a halt behind her. She did not dare look up or turn around. Miriam. She nearly jumped out of her skin. How on earth did he know her name? Heart beating faster than ever, she slowly turned her head to meet his gaze. "Sir?" Those large dark eyes flicked briefly to her answer sheet, and then she remembered that her name was written on it. And then he looked back at her. "How is it going?" "What, sir?" "Your exam." "Oh, fine, sir. It's going fine, sir." His right brow lifted slightly. "Are you sure?" His eyes roved over her face. "You are sweating." As if on cue, a bit of sweat slid down her temple. "Yes, sir. There is heat, sir," she managed. He straightened up. "All right. Continue." Miriam exhaled as he stepped away, but she did not dare relax. She glanced at her feet. The paper was still there, but she could not risk moving her leg. She could only continue writing whatever rubbish came to her head, especially as the man stayed in her section of the hall. Occasionally, he stopped behind other students, but her eyes kept darting to him every time he came close. "Stop writing. Everybody, pens down," Mr. Victor shouted. "Ha, Jesus! What? How? Mobile!" chorused across the hall. Miriam blinked, not believing it was over. Her answer sheet was still blank considering what she should have written. The first part was okay-ish, but there was a diagram that she had not drawn, and she was supposed to have used her ruler for something, but she did not know what. She cursed herself for not cramming the cheat sheet as a backup. All of you stand up and start coming to the front to submit your papers," Mrs. Abosede announced. Chairs screeched against the cement floor as students stood, stretching and straightening their uniforms. Miriam remained rooted to her seat. She glanced behind her. He was still there, arms crossed, looking everywhere. The paper was still under her shoe. She heard his footsteps again. Her heart began to beat faster. "Miriam?" She turned slowly. "Sir?" "Is there a problem?" She shook her head. No, sir. I'm just waiting for the others to submit. I'm sweating enough as it is. I don't want anybody to push me." The excuse sounded weak even to her, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. His eyes flicked down, catching the subtle shift of her leg, just an inch. His brow furrowed, and his mouth parted as though to say something. Suddenly a loud crash interrupted. All heads turned towards the teacher's desk, where the gift bag had fallen, spilling a bottle of Pepsi and a nylon bag of donuts onto the floor.
"Hey, what is wrong with you children?"
Mr. Victor shouted.
"Don't you know that thing is for a visitor?"
"It's okay, don't worry about it," the man said, turning towards the commotion. "Please just focus on collecting all the scripts."
Miriam did not hesitate. She bent down, snatched the paper, crumpled it into a ball and shoved it into her shirt.
By the time he looked back, she was standing, a shaky smile plastered on her face. He did not smile back. Holding her answer sheet, she walked towards Mr. Victor, careful to move slowly. If the paper inside her shirt fell, that is the end. Even as she handed in her answer sheet, she could feel the man's eyes on her back. There was no exam scheduled for the rest of the day, and she had no intention of lingering anywhere near the hall. She needed to put as much distance as possible between her and that man whose eyes she could still feel on her. As she walked around the corner, her heartbeat slowed. Never again, she thought. She would rather read her book than go through this type of foolishness again. Esther Eiyegbeni is a ghostwriter who resides in Ogun State. Aside from fantasizing about having 10 cats in the future, she's also a student and a blogger, busy turning random moments into stories. You can read more of her work on WordPress at Zelly Scribbles and connect with her on Instagram at ose_xle, on Facebook and LinkedIn at Esther Eiyegbeni, and on X at Osezelli. Details and links will be in the episode description. If you've got a story you would like to be featured on this podcast, or a published book you want to make into an audiobook, send an email to info@osadumebi.com or send me a message at osadumebi on either Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or X. I look forward to collaborating with you. And if you've enjoyed this week's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and tell someone, everyone, that stories are a good escape for a few minutes each week.